Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Tonight we have 9 stories coming out to just a little bit over 2 hours. I hope you all enjoy it. If you do, please be sure to drop a like rating. Let's go for 1200 likes on this one. Subscribing if you are new is also very much appreciated, as I post content just like this all of the time, and I'm always aiming to make it the best it can be. But yeah, with all of that being said, grab a snack, a coffee, pack a bowl, whatever it is that you do to relax, and let's get into these stories. Enjoy, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. "10 years ago, I dropped out of college. I was 19 and had barely made it through the first semester when I realized that it just wasn't for me. I didn't like being away from home and the prices were just too high. In a pinch, I decided to become a police officer. All that required was a GED, and I figured, hell, I can do this for a while to pay the bills. I ended up loving the job. I've been with it ever since and never regretted the decision of leaving college. However, it's not really the most high-paying job in the world. Life is expensive and my bills aren't exactly going down. I talked to some of my coworkers and quickly learned just how much I could be making with a college degree. It wasn't exactly a monumental difference, but it was enough to make life more comfortable for sure. I got some advice to enroll in the local community college, and decided to go for it. I had planned to start in the spring semester, but my schedule wasn't very flexible. I ended up working some things out with the chief and enrolled myself in 3 summer classes. Lucky for me, 2 of them were online. However, the online statistics class was full and the only availability was Tuesdays and Thursdays from 6 to 9. Now, I'm sure you're wondering why the hell I decided to take a nighttime statistics class in the summer. Why not wait until the fall to see if online opens up? Well, I'm required to get a math credit for my criminal justice degree. That seemed like the most obvious choice, but I absolutely hate math. I figured I'd get it out of the way early so that I could enjoy the better classes later on. The summer courses are also only 8 weeks long, so at least I'd be done quickly. This brings me to Thursday. It's my 5th week of classes and, yeah, they're exactly as awful as you'd think. The class is in the basement level of the downtown campus at the opposite end of the parking garage. This sucks even more because the last thing I want to do before sitting in a dark room for a 3-hour math lecture is walk all the way across the building through the maze of cinder block, windowless halls. A supremely depressing entrance to a supremely depressing class. Well, I drag my feet through the hallways and sit in my regular seat. A hard plastic blue chair in front of a tiny desk. It reminds me of those old desks from elementary school where I used to hide trading cards and gum. Except now I'm pushing 30, and the only thing I'm hiding is how uncomfortable this chair is. And I'm not hiding it well. The only thing that makes the class a little better is the pretty girl I sit next to. I've never had the guts to actually talk to her, but she gives me a lovely smile every time I go to sit down. She has long red hair and bright green eyes, and I learned through the attendance call that her name is Mary. She greets me as usual when I sit down, and I get distracted by the glimmer in her eyes. The professor, an old, balding man, walks in and takes his position at the front of the class. The lights go down and he illuminates his slides with a projector. He's a wrinkly, small man, but today he almost looked older. It was as if gravity was pulling him straight into the grave. His skin sagged. His knees buckled. He somehow looked even shorter. I began to count the days until my 30th birthday. I have never been fond of the idea of getting old. He began droning on about something or another starting with a Z. Z tables, maybe. Look, I know I should be taking my classes more seriously, but it was a long day and I was sincerely beat. I began to zone out thinking of Mary. I did this a lot. It didn't help that she was always in my line of sight. I thought maybe today would be the day that I talked to her. Maybe I'd ask her to grab coffee. I had to do it at some point. I'd never forgive myself if I chickened out for 8 weeks straight. I dozed off into my own little dreamland, and by the time I snapped out, Jesus. It was already 9:05. I might as well have skipped at that point because I clearly didn't learn a thing. Oh well. I'll just read over the post-it notes sometime over the weekend. But it was time to go home. And yet the professor was still droning on. I raised my hand to let him know class was over. I was more than ready to leave. He glanced at me for a split second, and yet didn't even acknowledge me. Professor Smith? I spoke to no avail. Professor Smith? It's 5 past. He glared at me. I will ask that you please do not interrupt the lecture. If you need to speak, you may raise your hand. Yeah, screw this. I don't know who pissed that guy off today, but I was over it. I grabbed my notebook and packed it into my bag before getting up and leaving the stale, cold room. If he has a problem with me walking out, then he should quit talking at the regular time. I walked back through the halls to the building's exit. The hallways were a maze, but I knew the walk well at this point. Left, right, left, right, out. On the prison-esque walls surrounding me were various art pieces I assumed were done by the students. I passed one that I hadn't seen before. It must have been new, but it caught my eye immediately. It was some abstract version of a face, I think. It looked like some sinister Picasso. The mouth fell below the chin in a twisted grin. The cheeks were tinged a strange purple hue. The eyes looked foggy white and clouded over. It gave me the creeps, and yet I couldn't stop looking at it. I must have been staring at it for 10 minutes before I snapped out and realized I needed to go home. No one had passed by me yet. Had he really not let class out yet? I turned my last right and headed towards the door under the glowing exit sign. I pushed it open, expecting the dimly lit street, but instead I walked straight into my classroom again. I shook my head in confusion and looked at the clock on the far wall. 6:05 it read. "You're late." The old man sneered at me. "Kindly take your seat." He began lecturing again, and instinctively, I took my place at my seat again. I was confused, but once again Mary turned and smiled in acknowledgement of my arrival. I turned to her for the first time, beginning to ask what was going on, but as soon as I opened my mouth, she turned her head in some unnatural and slow way towards me, bones popping in the process, and put a single finger to her lips before returning to listen to the lecture. Nope. I don't know what's going on, but I was going home. I abruptly sat up from my seat and walked out again. No one acknowledged me. I returned to the hallway. Left, right, left, right, out, but not out. Straight back into the classroom. The professor reprimanded me again. I sat down again. I mindlessly repeated the loop and sat back out again. Back in the classroom, reprimanded by the professor, acknowledged by Mary, and out again. I don't know how many times I repeated this loop, over and over again. Dozens, maybe hundreds of times. I lost count quickly. Left, right, or was it left, right? Left, right? I was getting dizzy. I couldn't tell how much time had passed. I decided to open the door to another classroom. Maybe by some miracle there would be a window in there, and I would climb out. I entered the room. Of course, I was back in my classroom. What the hell was happening? I backed out of the doorway. As I returned to the hallway, my eyes caught the painting again. This time I swear it was in a different place. Before, it was on a wall surrounded by other paintings and collages. Now, it was on its own. I know it sounds strange. Hell, all of this does. But the smile seemed larger, the face more sinister. I began to stare, transfixed once again. The longer I looked, the more my heart started to race and chills crept up along my arms and spine. It was like it was alive alive and staring straight at me. This time I ran to the exit, but to no avail. I still ended up in that horrible classroom. This time it was different. I walked back through the door, but no one acknowledged me. I looked to the clock, 6:05. The professor had already begun lecturing and everyone's heads were turned towards him. It was as if I wasn't there. I walked up to the professor, waved my hand in front of his face. Nothing. I turned to look at Mary, and my whole body went cold. Her face was contorted, her mouth twisted into a sinister smile, her cheeks were flushed a deep purple, and her eyes, once green and glittering, were pale, white, clouded over. As I looked around the room, I saw the same horrible expression on everyone's face. I felt sick to my stomach. I turned as quickly as I could and walked back out the doorway into the hall. There it was, the painting, directly outside the door in front of me. I instinctively backed away back into the classroom. What the fuck? Was all I could utter. At the sound of my voice, every head in the class turned to face me, their sinister smiles and foggy eyes trained on me. I turned tail and ran, sprinted as fast as I could down the hallway, not paying any attention to which direction I was going. All I could do was run. As I left, I could hear the scooting of the legs on the plastic seats, bodies shuffling out of the room. I think it's been 3 days, but there's really no way of telling. Maybe it's been hours, maybe weeks. As I maneuver the maze that is the basement, I sometimes hear them. I hear giggling, footsteps, knocks. Sometimes from far away, sometimes from what sounds like right around the corner. I know deep inside of me that I have to keep moving. I can't sleep. What if they find me? I'm getting weak, dizzy from the twisting halls. I don't know how much longer I can do this. I want to go home. I want out. Please, dear God, let me out. There's nothing more terrifying than the feeling of being watched. At least with horrible monsters, you know the extent of the horror based on their image. There is, however, a deep-seated fear within us all. Fear of the unknown, the mysterious, the unfathomable, unseen horror that lurks just beyond where you cannot see with your eyes. The presence of cameras should come as a comfort against that horror. They show you, hopefully for the better, what the thing is lurking around the corner. They show you areas you cannot see. Thus, there shouldn't be any fear of being seen by something you cannot see. This is all to say, cameras take away that fear. What is that fear replaced by then? When the cameras begin watching you. I'm working this summer as an intern in an office, not a cubicle farm by any means. The offices are separated from one another down one hallway. The hallway has 2 glass doors at either end. Both lead outside. There's also a large conference room towards one end of the office, right next to one of the doors leading outside. Most of the time, me and my fellow intern are alone in the office. Ever since working from home became a big thing, other coworkers don't show up nearly as often. Well, the 2 of us are required to come in. Well, this was a little aggravating at first. It's actually been great. There's no one to come in and tell us what to do. We can work at our own pace, and we can generally do whatever we want. This is within reason, of course. We're still expected to do our work. Usually this translates to working hard for a bit, goofing off for a bit, but still meeting the deadlines the company has set out for us. I usually come in the morning at 8 a.m. This gives me some time to get coffee and get settled in before starting work. The office has also gotten into setting up cameras around the place. There was already one pointing at the parking lot out the back door of the building, just to see if someone tries to break in. It also served the purpose of finding out who didn't lock the door when they were the last ones out of the building. It's mostly used for the latter, tracking them down and telling them about the importance of keeping the office space locked. Other than that camera though, there are cameras sitting around the office space. The company is only testing them out for now. Instead of drilling holes in the walls to mount them, they decided it would be better to set them up and see if they work well before actually putting them up. The cameras are sitting on top of buckets, and they are pointed around various angles. As you enter through the back door, you are immediately in a hallway that leads to the front door. The back door leads out to the parking lot behind the building. If you turn immediately left, there's a short hall, about 20 feet long and 15 feet wide. That leads to another door. I don't ever go in there. It's a rental space that the company rents out to another company. I don't know the details. Going forward, the hallway that leads from the back to the front is about 100 feet long and similarly about 15 feet wide. The office space has dotted along either side of the wall's doors into office spaces for different people. On the left wall, the walls are as follows from the first door to the last door. Storage room, break room, hallway that leads to restrooms and warehouse, office. Similarly, the right side is as follows. Manager's office, 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 conference room. It's also worth mentioning that the hallway where the restrooms are down is about 5 feet wide and 15 feet long. It ends in another door with a small window in it that leads to another office space connected to a warehouse. There's usually only one guy that works in there, and he pops over every so often. The conference room is where me and my fellow intern, we'll call him John, do most of our work. We have company-provided laptops that we do our work on, and we just sit at the big table, our screens away from the door. John usually gets into the office at 9 a.m., an hour after I arrive. Now, about the cameras. Let me tell you where all of them are. The first camera was up to the left of the back door, down the hallway as you enter, aimed at the back door. The second was further in the center hallway, aimed from the outside of the second office towards the front door. Could see the hallway leading to the restrooms and the front door. The third was settled across from the second, at the corner of the office leading to the restrooms. It could see the 3 offices on the right side of the office, and the storage room and break room on the other side. It also had a good view of the back door. This one I could see from where we sat in the conference room. The last one was situated outside the conference room and aimed at the front door. All of these cameras had a small camera feed in the storage room that could be connected via USB. They were constantly recording, and all of the data was saved to the cloud on a daily basis. Anyone could look at the camera feed by plugging in a device to it, so it was pretty handy to people inside the office. The first day this happened was a day like any other day of the week. It was a Wednesday. John and I had been working on an application for the company for the past couple of weeks, and we were just chatting. I was about to break from my laptop to go get lunch, and when I looked up from where I sat and out into the hallway, I saw the camera. The camera had been sitting atop the bucket of paint, like normal, except the camera had been turned to face down the hallway towards the other office's door. I stared at it for a few moments, a chill running down my spine. I looked over at John. I had been sitting next to him since 9 a.m., but asked anyway, "Did you move that?" I pointed at the camera. John looked up and over at the office camera. "No, I didn't." We both stared dumbfounded at the camera that had seemingly moved by itself. My mind fired off explanations for this occurrence, but was struggling to come up with anything coherent. Eventually, I landed on the idea that the other guy from the next office dropped by and bumped the bucket. He doesn't park in the same parking lot, so it would make sense why we wouldn't know he was there. I glanced up and down the hallway. Nobody was by the front door, and nobody was by the back door. All of the offices were closed and locked. No cars were seen in the parking lot save for mine and John's. We were alone like normal, but it didn't feel like it anymore. I went over to the camera. It was just sitting there, turned to face the wrong way. I reached down with my hand and spun it back to face the proper direction. I walked down the hall to the break room and got my lunch ready. After that, nothing happened for a little while. The next couple of days were pretty normal. The next thing happened after the weekend on Monday. I was in at 8 a.m. again and I was alone. John hadn't arrived yet and I was sitting in the conference room, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to get a little work done. It was about 8:45 when I heard a noise. It sounded like a light scraping. When I looked, I was so startled to see the camera again. Except time, instead of pointing down the hall to the restrooms, it was pointed directly at me. I stared into its beady little red dot and it stared right back at me. This time it was even more hair-raising. I was certain I was alone and John was not here to move it. I didn't hear the other office door open or close either. I stood up and walked down to the door of the conference room. I glanced up and down the office again, but no one was there. I reached down, spun the camera back into position, and kept looking over my shoulder as I walked back into the conference room. If this was some kind of prank, it was elaborate and well done. I thought it would be a good idea to go check the camera feed, to see if I could tell who was moving the camera. I brought my company laptop into the storage room, set it up, and plugged it in via a USB cord. The camera feed was live. It was aimed properly down the hallway after I moved it. When I started my internship, they walked us through how to operate the cameras, and told us there were a few seconds of delay between real life and the live feed. I clicked through the application to find the saved recordings. I found the date that matched today and clicked on it. It popped open a new window in front of the live camera feed with a 50-minute video. I clicked through the hour and watched the camera feed of the problem camera. I could see myself in the start entering, dropping off my lunch, heading to the conference room, etc. From there it was silence until around 45 minutes in. I heard the same scrape I had when I was in the office, but through the camera feed. There I was, sitting in the conference room. I looked up at the same time the scrape stopped and the camera feed cut over. I saw myself get up, walk over to the camera, and turn it back to normal. Then I saw myself walk into the storage room with my laptop, where the video ended, assumedly because I accessed the feed. I stood back dumbfounded. There was nothing else in the feed, but something had to have moved the camera. I remembered last week when the same thing happened, and closed the window to see if I could look at last Wednesday's recording. The first thing I noticed was that the lights around the office were blinking in the live feed. They were beginning to fade, then jumped back to life repeatedly within a few seconds of one another. Then I noticed something else. There was something on the live feed. I looked down the hallway, just outside of the room I was in, and there was a person peeking around the corner that led to the other office space by the back door. It wasn't a natural kind of peeking, as natural as that can be. Their head was perpendicular to the wall they were peeking around, at a strange 90-degree angle. Where the head was unnaturally tall, 7 feet above the ground. The thing had long black hair that dropped down to the floor, longer than 7 feet. It made almost a pool of black tangled mess. The most terrifying thing of all, however, is that it couldn't be mistaken for a human. The thing didn't have a face. In place of a face, eyes, nose, a mouth, it had the large black lens of a dome camera instead. In the center blazed a large red LED light, blinking on and off, staring down the long hallway towards the room I was in. Even in broad daylight, it was hard to tell what it was with the blinking lights. The lights above made it almost disappear when they went out, save for the red light which still blinked out of rhythm with the ones above. I recoiled from the laptop. It was all I could do to just stand there and watch. I was too afraid to leave, too afraid to run, too afraid to even move. I looked back at the door, then back at the screen. Its head began to move. The red light disappeared as it creaked back behind the corner, its long mess of hair dragging on the floor behind it. It disappeared, the light stopped blinking, and it was quiet. I stepped over to the door, peeked out, and nothing peeked back. I slid along the wall and peeked around the corner. The thing I saw was standing. Nothing. I was well, and thoroughly freaked out at this point. I started whipping my head around to see if there were any other people. I was still alone in the office space. I went back into the storage room and accessed the camera again. This time looking at the other camera it had to be standing in front of while it was peeking. Nothing. No person peeking around the corner. Not a car driving in the parking lot. Absolutely nothing. I abandoned my laptop where it sat and walked back out into the hallway, checking around once more. The cameras were all pointed properly, all on and recording. I froze in my tracks and heard the back door open. I yelled out loud as I looked. "You alright, man?" It was John, and it was 9 a.m. I took comfort in having another human being there, and I eventually calmed back down. After explaining everything, John tried to reassure me there was nothing inside the building, and that there must be some reasonable explanation. It worked to calm me for a while, but after moving the cameras back into position, it didn't stop me from checking. I moved the camera feed as well, from inside the storage room to inside the conference room. I did this just in case I needed to quickly check. Every so often, I would just hook it up to my phone and cycle through all the cameras to see if something moved. Constantly streaming the camera feed was hell on my battery life, but it was worth it to make sure. Then the end of the day came. John usually arrives later and leaves earlier than me. He has a second job he usually runs to at around 2 p.m., but we were happy for such flexibility in an internship. This usually means that I'm alone again after that time between 2 and 5. It's when the sun gets a little lower. The quiet gets a little more eerie, like being in a liminal space. Maybe in the morning you're just too tired to care about how alone you are. At night your senses tend to think a bit for themselves. You become hyper-aware of sounds and draw macabre conclusions about the circumstances. Then you write it off as just being paranoid. There's something different about a place when you feel like you shouldn't be there. Something deeply unsettling. By the end of the day, it was raining. Darkness ate the light outside and you could hear the clap of thunder after a brief flash of bolts across the sky. Rain should be comforting when you work. A relaxing patter ran across the windows of the conference room as I typed away. I was paranoid now, however, that comfort for me was damaged by an incessant need to look up towards the door. That paranoia had its own curiosity though. I remembered last Wednesday, the first time I noticed the cameras moved. I accessed the cloud recordings of the day on my phone, and looked at that first day when the camera was turned towards the other office. As lightning flashed, the feed pulled up. A dull rumble went through the room as I swiped my finger over the time looking for something. Anything. Found what I was looking for. There was someone in the small window leading into the other office. The lights began to blink in the office space beyond the door, as they did over here the first time I saw the creature. In between the pulses, there was a single red light visible in the window. When the lights came back on, it was there. The thing with the camera face. It peeked through the small window connecting the two offices. The lights continued to pulse in the office. It just stood there for a short while. Finally, it moved. Between one of the pulses, I saw its head move through the door. Its body was half stuck in between the two offices, as it began pulling itself through without the door being opened. And then my phone died. The battery had run out. Chills ran all around me, and I suddenly had the unnerving feeling of being watched. The lights outside the conference room began to pulse again. They sounded like they had when I saw the thing the first time. I glanced up at the camera outside the conference room just as a lightning bolt streaked behind me, bathing the room in a fading, eerie glow. Then the low rumble of thunder shook my core. I looked to see the camera pointed at me again. The lights in the office pulsed. This time it was all of them in the building, from the hallway to the room I was in. I quickly pulled the cord from my phone and jammed it into the laptop, not taking my eyes off the camera. The rumble of the thunder finally stopping. The live feed showed me tinkering on my laptop, with a few seconds of delay between my movements and the feed. Then I saw it, the thing peeking around the corner and in the other office, right outside the door. It was just out of my view, standing on the left of the frame around the corner of the door. The head of the creature was cut off of the upper side of the frame, but its long black hair still trailed across the floor. At that moment, its body was visible. It looked like a long gown, ragged and tattered. The skin was sickly and pale, as though coated in a sheen of white paint. The limbs were the worst part. Long, lanky, unnatural. At the end of its hands were sharp, jagged pieces of what looked to be a film reel. I saw its legs beginning to bend. The knees bent inwards. I heard a sickening crack from outside the door. Its legs shook and faltered as it lowered its head into the frame. The dome head of the camera lens came into view, staring into the camera, staring at me. The next pulse of the lights made the hall go dark. When the feed had returned, the creature was standing upright again. I saw it lean forward, its hair dragged across the floor. It was unnatural, with no muscle, just sinewy movement that cracked and churned. Its head started moving towards the door, to look at me. I looked up at the door, watching, waiting for the thing to come into view. The lights continued to pulse. I stood up and stepped away from the laptop. I started considering my options. Run up and close the door. I was on the right side for it. There wasn't any way that could work, though, if it was right next to the door. Jump through the window? I was on the ground floor, but I'd need to somehow get enough force to ram into it. Smash the window. Smashing the window was my only option. The lights went dark, no longer pulsing. Off. I grabbed a chair and threw it at the window. Not a crack. I heard a sharp sound from behind me. It sounded like someone saying, "Psst." When I turned around, I couldn't see the door. It was dark outside, raining, and the lights were all off. It was so quiet, so silent you could hear every drop of rain. I saw a red light in the doorway, blinking, staring at me. Then the lightning flashed, illuminating the room for a moment, and that was all it needed. I saw it in the doorway. It was crawling underneath the door frame, bending down to walk under it. The head tilted at me as the flash erupted. I thought I heard its neck crack as it did. It looked emaciated, thin, lanky, but with enough control to pounce. It creaked deeper into the room as the lightning faded. I was once again plunged into darkness, its red light simmering on me. I felt like screaming but was frozen with fear. It didn't move for a few moments. The only other way out was through the door it was standing in front of. It just stared at me, taking me in. It stood there for as long as the thunder rumbled. We stared at each other, perhaps waiting for one to make a move. Lightning fast. Another lightning flash coated its body. It clambered onto the table in front of me on all fours. I saw a deep, gaping maw appear on its face. The dome camera split in half. When it opened this god-awful, mechanical mouth, I could see hundreds and hundreds of human eyes within, writhing, watching me, staring at me. Its maw extended deep into an unseen void that descended forever. I was gazing into a valley of stars, though it was just glints of light off the iris of the eyes. Blinking, watching, recording, they all gazed upwards to a light that would never be reached. "Move!" my mind screamed. As its head gnashed towards mine, I ducked my head, scraping it against the creature's chin. I heard the crash of glass as its face reconnected at the center of the seam. I dove underneath the conference room table, rolled to the other side, and sprinted into the hallway. Then towards my car. I could hear the thing fumbling behind me. The table sounded to be thrown across the room. I heard the scrape of metal on metal as it let out a howl so menacing it cut me to my soul. It sounded like a deep, metallic scream of a man in pain. I shouldn't have looked back as I sprinted towards the back door. When I did, I saw the red light gaining quickly. Lightning flashed again. Its arms were stretched outwards towards me, its mouth agape. The jagged film reel fingers reached out towards me, trying to claw at my back. I sprinted harder and eventually crashed the door leading outside. I felt the rain coating my face, and I stumbled down into a puddle at the front of the door. I crawled the rest of the way out into the parking lot. When I looked back, the lights in the office were blinking again. The creature stood at the door, staring out at me. In between pulses, seemingly without moving its body, it got further away from the door. I saw it moving back a few paces, move back a few more on the next pulse. Then it went into the storage room, its head peeking out of the door. Finally, on the last pulse, it disappeared from view. The light stayed on after that, solid, bright, powerful, and safe if you didn't know what lurked inside. I ran to my car and got the hell out. I never went back to the office. Part of me wondered if there was another reason why work from home was so popular amongst our coworkers. I told John to not go in the office if he could help it. I didn't bother answering calls from the company and did everything I could to find something else. I don't know what that thing was, and to this day, I have a striking fear of dome cameras. I stare and wait for them to split open, to devour me whole. I live in the American Northwest, somewhat close to the Cascade range. I have always adored any and all kinds of nature, but I have a particular love for the climate of this region. I moved here years ago, after spending my latter years as a teenager, romanticizing the idea of living amongst the vast forests of snow-tipped pines and hemlock. I spend as much time as I can in nature. I can tell you what bird calls belong to which bird, which berries are edible and which ones aren't, how to start a fire, and so forth. I make it a point to learn as much as I can about nature. I don't say any of this to gloat or to brag about my knowledge. I'm telling you this because it's relevant to what happened to me. When I get full weeks off from my job, I spend at least part of the week alone, deep in a forest somewhere. A lot of people would call what I do bushcraft, but I like to call it enjoying nature. Having said that, after my most recent excursion, I'm not sure if I'll ever go through the wilds again. Not alone, at least. I got a week off for Christmas and New Year's, and after celebrating Christmas with my family, I had planned to spend 4 days in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, close to the border of Canada. I'd been in this area before during a summer and wanted to visit the same spot during the winter, so I had some vague familiarity with everything there. Now, if you aren't familiar with the hobby, bushcraft is essentially surviving by yourself in nature, far, far away from any campsites maintained by other people, and you usually bring a good array of man-made tools to help you. When you get to your site, you might dig up some earth, cut a few small trees, and gather up a lot of branches with leaves on them. All depending on your circumstances, of course, but the goal is to build a shelter with the materials you find in nature. And after that, just live out there for a few days before returning to the madness of society. So for my trip, I packed an array of items, including a compass, a portable wood stove, a sleeping bag, many changes of clothes, a shovel, a few smaller hand tools including an axe for wood chopping, and most importantly, a lot of matches and different types of fire starters packed in plastic baggies so they can't get ruined by any moisture. Matches are one of the most important things you can bring to a survival trip. I packed multiple bags, and one small bag I'd keep in my personal pack on my person at all times, just in case. I also brought some snowshoes, as I knew the terrain would be covered in a blanket of snow. There is a lot of other stuff I packed too, but these are all the really important items. The first day was pretty uneventful. I left from a campground pretty early in the morning, around 5 a.m., and walked west for what I think was between 5 to 10 miles. I'm not really sure how fast I was walking, but it couldn't have been too brisk a pace because I had to don the snowshoes about halfway through the trip, which slowed me down considerably. But the trip was at least a couple hours because the sun was still rising when I arrived at my destination. And before you get worried, there's a very long road which runs into the campground from the south, and out of it roughly to the north. So as long as I just walk straight back east, I'd be able to find the campground pretty easily once I find the road. Anyways, I started shoveling snow out of the way and making a clearing for my shelter. This involved shoveling a lot of soft earth and making a small indent on the ground, where eventually my sleeping area would exist under the comfort of a simple wooden roof. I spent much of the day gathering wood for the wood stove, branches with leaves on them for my roof, and basically just getting a lot of wood. Close to sunset, I had very little left to do for my shelter. It wasn't very big, just large enough that I could sit comfortably inside, and long enough to fit my sleeping bag and the wood stove. I built a little porch too, which I plan to spend a lot of my time sitting in the lawn chair there, reading, drinking coffee, and thinking about God knows what. After I finished the shelter, I ate dinner, read a little bit inside the shelter, and went to sleep. Again, pretty uneventful. I woke up well before sunrise the next morning and made some coffee. Then I donned some hefty winter clothing and just sat outside on the porch for a while, staring out into the Twilt forest, with just my coffee and my thoughts. Above, I could just barely see the Milky Way against the violet blackness of space, and of course, millions of stars accompanying the image. I looked for a while and watched them dragged helplessly along their course through the sky. I was lost in the beautiful image before me, until I heard, well, at that point, I didn't really know what I had just heard. I also almost thought it was two trees rubbing against each other in the wind, making that creaking noise, but the sound I heard was much more organic, like it was coming from a throat. On top of that, there was the presence of a kind of low static humming which was intertwined with the creaking, like what you'd hear from a TV tuned to a station with no broadcast, but a much lower tone. This is a poor description because I don't even know if my ears were built to hear such a thing. My gut reaction was to just stay put and see if I could hear it again. The naturalist in me wanted to see if my ears could discern what kind of animal it came from upon hearing it another time. But then I thought it over. Aside from moose, or maybe some other small fauna, I couldn't think of anything that would wander the snowy mountainside this time of year, let alone making any noises while the sun's not up. Plus, I knew what all those animals sounded like. After having this thought, my instinct was telling me to get inside immediately. Not that my wooden shelter would have done much to protect me, but still. I darted inside and didn't even fold up my chair to bring it back in. I'll be honest, the more I thought about it in those moments, the more it scared me. Through the few small patches in my roof between the leaves, I continued watching the stars pass overhead until the sun came up. I didn't hear the sound again that morning. Still, I was shaken up by it. I considered the notion of packing up and heading back that day. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Ultimately, I convinced myself that it was indeed probably a semi-fallen tree rubbing against another tree, and that the static I heard was just the wind flowing through the pine needles far above. So I opted to stay. In the afternoon, I put on my snowshoes and meandered around the area, telling myself I was looking for more wood to stock up for the wood stove. But what I was honestly doing was trying to find a tree that was leaning against another tree, or some other indication of whatever made the otherworldly noise. I would walk one direction until there was no more space between my left arm and my body for more fallen branches. Then bring the firewood back and find another direction. After the fourth or fifth trip, something caught my eye, a Vanta-black figure, partly concealed behind the lower branches of a hemlock tree, in broad daylight, mind you. But what was standing there was definitely a person, or it had the shape of one at least. Startled partly by the abrupt presence of another person this far out in nature, and partly because of what happened that morning, I called out, partially to myself, "Hey, what the fuck?" No response. My fight or flight was being triggered in that moment. Time slowed down. Still half believing it to be a person, my gut reaction was to get closer and ask, probably aggressively, how they got out here. I tried to get a better look. It still just looked like a silhouette, but it looked like they had no heavy winter gear. And though I couldn't see their feet or the bottom of their legs, the way they were standing made me think they didn't have the gear to be walking through the heavy snow in this area. I almost started to feel bad for them, and I hoped they were okay. Despite that, I was still deeply afraid of the image before me. All this in a split second. I took a step forward, which didn't help me get a better look. The figure was largely still obscured behind the needle leaves of the tree. I yelled out, "Hey!" Again, no response. As I took another step forward, the figure was no longer there. I don't remember if I blinked before it was gone, or if it simply disappeared before my eyes. I stood there in disbelief for a second, then approached the tree to investigate. There was nobody behind it, and no footprints where the figure had clearly been standing, and, more amazingly, no footprints at all except my own, anywhere. I thought maybe they ran off the moment I had blinked, or something to that effect, but no evidence of the thing was there at all. I thought for a second, then the events that had just occurred really hit me. I felt nothing but pure terror. Despite the comforting warmth of the sun and the presence of light everywhere, the light made me feel watched. I actually wished it was night so I could sneak away out of sight. But I dropped all the wood I'd gathered and hustled back to my shelter as fast as I could through the snow. On my way back, I considered walking back to the campground, but based on the position of the sun, I felt like I wouldn't have time in the day to safely do so. The walk would take at least a couple hours. Then I'd have to hike another mile or so back to my car. I decided it would be best to hunker down for one more night, and then bolt the moment the sun came up. Then I heard the noise from this morning again, louder and closer to me. It sounded similar to what I heard that morning, but more drawn out. At the end of it, I remember a fast breeze passing through. Though breeze is hardly the right word for it because the air was hot. I still had no idea what to make of any of it. All I knew was that I was scared for my life. I wish I could tell you more, but all I did at that point was continue walking back. What else could I do? The loud clamor occurring twice that day, and the figure behind the tree, I knew deep down that they were related somehow. As I approached my shelter, I remember feeling dread at the very bottom of my stomach. Looking at the wooden structure from a distance, I couldn't see anything outwardly wrong with it, but something inside of me was telling that the safety of the shelter was compromised. I walked for a couple more seconds before seeing what was wrong was that all of the leaves on the roof were absent. All of the branches and twigs were still in place, but the leaves were not. I stopped and looked around. A part of me was horrified at the prospect of seeing the figure anywhere near what was supposed to be my little safe space in nature. The other part of me was telling me to hurry up and get inside. There was nothing notable around, just the endless pine forest and sunlit snow. I looked back at the sky and considered again the prospect of leaving the forest right that moment. I weighed the idea of walking through the snow with no sunlight. I knew that I could probably make it back, but it was really risky. I was afraid that my mind would be too focused on whatever was out there with me, that I would lose the attention to my compass and get lost. In hindsight, none of this really sounds reasonable. I should have left that morning after all. I'm just trying to convey what was going through my head. So, I opted to go inside and get the wood stove started, then go out and get more leaves to cover the roof back up. I walked down into the small living area and put some wood in the stove. The sun pierced through the roof and I felt vulnerable. I reached into one of my bags to grab some matches to get the fire started. I knew exactly where I left them, so I didn't look as I reached in. When my hand reached the pocket that one of the bags of matches was stored in, I felt something wet. When I pulled out the Ziploc bag, it had been filled with a translucent liquid that had a deep purple hue. It was very vicious. I quickly looked for my other bags of matches and fire starters. They had all been drenched. I started to panic for a moment, but I remembered the small backup bag that I keep in my pouch. I never had to use them in the past, so they didn't come to my thoughts immediately. But I reached in, and again, the bag was filled with the horrid sludge, so I had no means of starting a fire. The recent snowfall meant that most of the woods was damp, and even though I knew how to start a fire without matches, I doubted that I could because I admittedly did not practice the skill as much as I should have, especially with the wood not being of optimal quality. I looked up through the grid roof of branches. The sun was halfway to the horizon. If I packed then and left, I'd only be walking in the dark for maybe an hour. I really had no choice at that point, so I started packing as quickly as I could. I took the wood out of the wood stove and threw it on the ground outside, and folded it up into its compact state. I rolled up my sleeping bag and tucked it into my large travel pack. Most of everything else was already packed as there had been no need to take any of it out. I finished packing and decided to leave the bags of matches there in the shelter. The liquid inside must have been very dense because they added a lot of weight to my pack. I had thought about taking them home, but it was as if whenever I put one bag in my pack, I no longer had the strength to carry it on my back. I stepped outside, and I once again heard the dreaded yawn from deep in the forest. Then I felt the warm breeze. The hot air pushed eastward quickly. I didn't notice at first, but I soon realized that none of the surrounding trees had any leaves on them. In the distance behind them, I could see that the pines still had their needles, but the ones in my immediate vicinity were stripped bare. The landscape looked as though there had been a forest fire. It was as though the bare pines themselves were a threat. Even still, I didn't hesitate to start walking east immediately, passing under some of the trees. With every step, I feared that I would look up and see the silhouette figure again. but I tried to keep most of my attention on my compass so I didn't walk in the wrong direction. I also just wanted to stop thinking about everything that had happened. I didn't even know what to make of the match bags, or how I would explain any of it to my family when I got back. I wondered if I should even try telling them, or anyone. It all sounded so unreal. I heard another of the noises followed again by an intensely hot breeze which pushed against my back. It was going the same direction that I was. It was at that point that I realized the snow in my path had melted enough to take off my snowshoes. So I did, and I picked up the pace. I continued to walk for what had to be 45 minutes to an hour. The sun was about to set. The path took me to a small incline where I was able to look back and see the tops of trees where I had been walking. In the distance, the sun hid behind a mountain, and the shadow of the mountain struck the landscape. I tried to look for the bare pines around the area I had stayed in. I looked hard and it took me a few moments to locate them, but I did see them. It was difficult to tell from such a distance, but it seemed like the leafless trees formed a circle in the middle of the forest. I pondered that thought for a second, but something caught my eye above the discolored spot in the forest. I am sad to say that that is all I can tell you. I wish I could describe what I saw, but all I know is that something was suddenly there on top of the dead trees. Whatever it was, had simultaneously been moving erratically, yet also kept itself very still. It was both moving and not. I tried to get a better look out of sheer curiosity, but something came over me, and I immediately turned around and kept walking. It was as though my instincts and fear overrode my rational thinking in that moment, which was probably for the best. The further from the shelter I got, the better I felt. The rest of the walk was uneventful after that. I reached the campground a little after sunset, and when I got to my car, it was around 5:30 p.m. I made it home safely, but I couldn't make sense of anything that happened. While I was extremely unnerved, I never felt like I was ever in any actual danger. I've told some close friends about this, and they believe me, but they don't really know what to tell me. It's been half a year since all this happened, and I wanted to share this story here, if only to get input from others about the strange occurrences. Maybe someone knows of a reasonable explanation. I've been losing sleep thinking about it. Sometimes as I'm drifting asleep, I'll hear what is actually just some trees rubbing against each other, and a primal fear will surge through me. I also have dreams where I am stranded without equipment, and the Vanta Black figure from the forest stares at me. I still don't know what to make of the purple sludge that invaded my match bags. A part of me wants to go back out to investigate, but I will definitely not be going alone if I do. Going back out this time of year would come with the risk of all the wildlife roaming about, but at the same time I think their presence would comfort me, knowing I'm not the only thing from this planet out there. Anyways, thanks for reading this. If anyone has any ideas or explanations, let me know. I'd love to get past this and move on with my life. It all started with bitter rejection, utter humiliation. That evening I made the unfortunate decision to go see Mindy. My best buddy Cliff tried to talk me out of it, but I was madly in love with the girl. She was way out of my league, of course. Cliff attempted to tell me so. Most crushes are. I should have trusted Cliff. After all, he was the one with the girlfriend. At least, he told me so. I had never met her. But I didn't even have an imaginary girlfriend to show for, so I turned a deaf ear and set off to see Mindy. This was pre-Facebook or Instagram, you see. No such thing as sending out an invite. You actually had to go see your crush to get properly rejected. Now, why did I choose to go to her house and not just ask her out at school? That's an interesting question because Mindy lived in a farmhouse outside town, a mile or so into the woods. As darkness was setting in, I actually began to regret my decision. Then the Jones property finally appeared into view. A great slab of land surrounded by trees with a stately manor in the middle. Not much farming going on here. I knew Mindy's dad was loaded and had fixed the place up to be a quiet home in the woods. Leaving my bicycle and starting for the house, I murmured, "Hey Mindy, wanna go see a movie?" My heart drummed in my throat as I stepped onto the porch and reached for the doorbell. Just a small wait. Then Mindy greeted me herself. She looked surprised to see me. To make matters worse, one of her cheerleader friends stood beside her. Fuck. I would have turned away right there and then. "Steve, can I help you?" The subject of my obsession queried. "Hi, Mindy," I began. My voice shook, and the next words came out like glue. "Wanna go see a movie sometime?" Her friend snickered. Mindy's face clouded. "Oh," Mandy said, elbowing her stupid friend. "I mean, you're a decent guy, Steve, but I'm not interested. See you around, okay?" "Yeah, sure, She had already slammed the door into my face. I could overhear Mindy's friend burst into laughter, and Mindy's irritated but amused response. I just stood there on the porch for a while, heart in shambles. Then I returned to my bicycle with sagging shoulders, convinced I would never find love. But that was not how the evening ended. Cursed tears stung my eyes as I made my way home. My weak front light barely lit the pitch-dark forest road, but the small light did find the figure that suddenly entered the road. Braking hastily, I almost dropped from my saddle, eyeing the stranger. It was a pretty girl, even more pretty than Mindy, in fact. Raven black hair fell on her shoulders and dark eyes found me. I briskly wiped the tears from my eyes. "Don't cry for her. She's a bitch." "Who?" I started at her words. "Who are you? You live around here?" "I do. I'm the foster kid. Of the Joneses, I mean," the girl said. "Been with him for a while now. I'm Isabel." She held up a bottle that looked an awful lot like bourbon. "You look like you need a drink." My eyes grew big. "Where did you get that?" "Ripped it from my asshole foster dad. Want a sip or not?" I hesitated, but was well aware that a beautiful girl just asked me out drinking. Mindy had been a mistake. This actually happened. So I nodded. "Sure." We sat down behind the trees. Just shy of 16, this was the first time I got really hammered. We talked for hours, about movies, music, and bullshit. Isabel didn't open up about herself a lot. Since I had never seen her around, I figured she went to a different school than Mindy. When I finally got up to leave, my companion surprised me by planting a kiss on my mouth. Her lips were cold as ice, but obviously, I didn't care about that. "You want to come back to my house?" she asked. "I know a shortcut." She gestured at the dark trees with a daring look in her eyes I could barely resist. But Mindy was still in the back of my mind. Wouldn't want to run into her again. "Not tonight," I said, regret seeping through in my voice. "I should really go. My parents are probably wondering where I am." She looked disappointed, but then her face cleared. "Fine. See you later, village boy." Isabel smiled, kissing me again. Longer, this time. I offered to take her home, but she shook her head. "I know a shortcut, remember?" Fuck Mindy, I thought on the way home. Now I know how it feels to be in love. My lips still tingled. I realized this had been the first time I kissed a girl. No, I reconsidered proudly. She had kissed me. The next couple of weeks were one of the best of my life. I went to see Isabel a lot, always in that same spot between the trees. We made out and did a lot of other stuff as well, stuff I only dreamt of doing with the girl a few weeks ago. Cliff clearly noticed something, but he was also busy with his girlfriend. We didn't see much of each other than at school. I don't know why I didn't open up about Isabel. Perhaps because it felt a bit strange, telling him I was meeting some girl in the forest. Thinking back now, that was kind of weird. Isabel invited me back to her place every time. I never gave in. Uneager to run into Mindy. I wonder if she ever spotted me with her foster sister. She obviously didn't care. And then Mindy died. A crosswalk and a drunk driver. This was all it took to end her life in an instant. The school was shocked. The town was shocked. Mindy had been extremely popular. I went to the memorial just like everybody else in school. I never saw people as broken as the Jones. Mindy had been their only daughter. Their real daughter, I mean. Isabel sat with them, staring at Mindy's coffin with empty eyes. She held the hand of Mr. Jones as he cried, never so much as throwing me a look. That was surprising. I thought she hated her foster dad. But when I went to see her afterwards, my girlfriend had disappeared. I had half the mind to offer the Jones my condolences and ask them where Isabel was. Something held me back. Felt selfish. Around that same time, Cliff went missing. He had told his parents he was going to do homework at my place, though he had never made such plans. I figured he snuck off with his girlfriend somewhere, but a couple of days in, he still hadn't returned home. The police got involved and found his car at the edge of town. Cliff wasn't in it. Neither was his girlfriend, for that matter. Of course, I was concerned about my friend and helped the police as best as I could, but I have to admit, my heart was somewhere else. Isabel had stopped texting me. That was weird because she had been sending me messages almost every day. I rode to the spot in the woods a couple of times, but she was nowhere to be seen. It ate away at me, and I started to get worried. I realized how little I knew about her. I didn't even know the school she went to. So one day, I decided to go see her at the Jones place. As I parked my bicycle and stepped into the lawn, I noticed a change around the farm. I couldn't shake this oppressing feeling, like something bad had happened. Last time I had been here, I had asked Mindy out. I realized as I stood on the porch, and now she was dead. Hard to imagine. It also hit me I hadn't thought about Mindy's death since the memorial. Isabel was in the front of my mind. I rang the doorbell, silently praying Isabel would answer the door. No such luck. Mr. Jones appeared. He looked terrible, with grayish hanging skin and dark circles under his hollow eyes. I guess that's what losing a child does to you. The whole thing suddenly felt awkward. Mr. Jones, I stuttered. I'm so sorry about your daughter. I always liked Mindy a lot. I dropped a moment of silence, but he just stared at me like he hadn't even heard. Is Isabel home? The question finally got his attention, his eyes fixed on me like a cat. Isabel? He mumbled. Isabel. How do you know? Then his eyes flashed to a point behind me. Hey, you! He pushed me aside, running down the lawn, heading for the forest. That's not what you promised. You said I would get my daughter back. That's not my daughter. I stared with open mouth as Mr. Jones disappeared between the trees. I wondered if I should follow him. He clearly wasn't in his right mind. Then I turned and gazed down the hallway. Something felt wrong, and Isabel could be inside. In trouble. I hesitated for a second, touching my phone in my pocket. Maybe I should call the cops first. But I didn't. I stepped into the house. It was dark inside, as if every curtain was closed. A musty, nauseating smell entered my nostrils. From the hallway, I saw dishes piled up on the kitchen counter. There clearly hadn't been any cleaning for a while. I heard some shuffling upstairs and queried, "Isabel?" Nothing. "Mrs. Jones?" I added. No reply followed. I headed upstairs step by step, starting to get really nervous. Standing on the landing, heart drumming in my throat, I could make out that shuffling once more. It came from behind a door in the back. "Isabel? Mr. Jones?" I repeated. The sounds from the back room turned up when I spoke their names, but no reply followed. I took another step and froze. The door opened, inch by inch. Fingers curled around the corner. The person that appeared wasn't Isabel or Mrs. Jones. It was Mindy. But she didn't look anything like the Mindy I had known. I screamed and stumbled backwards. I missed the first step and dropped down the stairs. I landed on my back but ignored the pain. Scrambling upwards, I made for the front door down the lawn, heading for my bicycle. I didn't look back once as I sped down that dark forest road. Then a movement in the trees caught my eye. It was Isabel, disappearing in the woods. She was naked. I jumped off my bicycle and ran for her. What the fuck was going on? "Isabel," I yelled. "Wait!" But entering the forest, my girlfriend was nowhere to be seen. Then I spotted her a couple of yards ahead. Thinking back, I don't know how I could. It was pitch dark in the forest. I kept on yelling her name, but she didn't respond. What happened in that house? Walking aimlessly, I noticed a shimmering light between the trees. Fire. I headed for the light and suddenly found myself on the edge of a clearing. Straight ahead, a tall slab of stone stood upwards. Behind it, something burned. I couldn't see what it was, but it had the vague smell of roasted meat. A figure shuffled around the fire, and there were sounds, wails, crying, someone screaming for help. A familiar voice. "You found the shortcut." Someone spoke behind me. Two strong hands locked my arms. I screamed, somehow managing to shake free from the steel grip. I ran blindly for the opposite side of the forest. I trashed through the thickets for a while, thwarting tree trunks. Then the woods stopped and I was back on the road. I looked wildly around me, no clue which way town was. A rustling in the trees behind me forced me to pick a side. Fortunately, it was the right one. My parents couldn't make any sense of the incoherent story I uttered between panicking sobs. My dad simply called the police. When the cops investigated the Jones farm, they didn't catch any sign of Mindy. What they did encounter was Mr. Jones dangling from a rope. Mrs. Jones was found a couple of yards into the woods. What was left of the poor woman, anyway. Her body had been burned to crisps beneath a tall slab of stone. Remembering the smell of roasted meat, I retched when I heard, "What about Cliff?" I found myself asking when I was questioned by the police. "Any sign of him?" The detective shook her head. "Why do you ask?" "No reason," I murmured. "And Isabel?" As I was questioned, I kept asking them about the Jones foster daughter. They were looking into it. They kept replying. When they took me in for another round of questioning, I tried once more. "There's no record of an Isabel ever living there." The woman answered brusquely, "Mindy was their only daughter." "But," I muttered, that's impossible. I knew her. But it wasn't that surprising. Since the police asked, I had tried to find her number and texts on my phone. They were nowhere to be found. Vanished. The detectives eventually cleared me. It was established pretty quickly that Mr. Jones killed his wife. To what motive they never discovered. There hadn't been any notes of any kind. Something to do with the trauma of Mindy's death, perhaps. The horrific incident was labeled a domestic dispute, and that was that. My first girlfriend was never seen again, and neither was Cliff. Other girls came, and I'm in a steady relationship for years now. We all have to grow up sometime, right? Which brings me to last weekend when my girlfriend and I decided to stay the weekend at my folks'. They actually moved. Their new house being a lot closer to the forest where I used to meet Isabel. The guest room is located on the ground floor, adjoined by the garden. The sound of a text message woke me up late at night. Groggy, I reached for my phone and stared at my screen. My heart skipped a beat. "Hey, village boy, wanna meet?" In the same instant, I thought I heard a soft tap on the bedroom window. I lurched upwards, my heart drumming, and stared at the window. Had there been a movement, could have just been my imagination. My girlfriend was still fast asleep as I crept across the bedroom and opened the balcony door. Nothing. No one to be seen, but there was something on the outside tiles. An empty bottle of bourbon. Gulping, I gazed at the dark tree line at the end of the yard. I couldn't spot anyone. A sick joke, but who knew? As I stepped back inside, a soft giggling turned my stomach into ice. I would always remember that voice, but it was different now. Twisted. When I saw a pale arm reach for me from the corner of my eye, I slammed the door and dove between my blankets. I didn't get much sleep that night. The incident has sparked a lot of memories. That blind trashing through the forest. The smell of roasted meat. And above all, my best friend screaming for help. I've been in a rough place lately. Last month I had to bury my older sister, Kennedy, after she'd lost her battle to brain cancer. I also quit my warehouse job a couple weeks ago as the daily verbal abuse was becoming too much to bear. Now, as a 24-year-old man living by himself in an apartment, the clock can only tick so much before the next rent cycle comes around. Kennedy's funeral wasn't cheap, and neither is my ongoing therapy. Stack inflation and the heavy cost of living in Vancouver on top of that, and you've got a recipe for anxiety and unending worry. So, whether it was just placebo, or if it actually worked, I decided to try praying for the first time ever last night, but the response I got shook me to my core. I've never been a particularly spiritual guy. Both my parents were Presbyterian Christians. But they weren't the devout type that were at every Sunday service. They also didn't force Kennedy and I to read scriptures or pray with them. However, Kennedy always joined them without hesitation. Ever since I could remember, she was recounting all sorts of biblical tales and parables to me. I never really took them to heart, but I always found the details fascinating. My favorite was when she'd tell me the story of Noah's Ark because I was really into animals growing up. Fast forward to a year ago, and Kennedy's faith was as strong as ever. She was doing really well in her career and had started a beautiful family of her own before her diagnosis. We hung out every so often and detailed what had been going on in our individual lives. She was always incredibly rational and approached problems logically rather than purely out of faith. However, when we both were unable to solve a problem either of us had, she always said a word of prayer. Now, I didn't really believe in prayer, so I just kind of closed my eyes and waited for her to finish. I figured it was best that way anyhow, since I personally wouldn't want to feign religious faith just for the sake of it. However, her praying with me did help me feel a bit calmer and less stressed. Whether that's placebo or not, I don't know. But last night, I decided to give it a try myself. After all, I had put in dozens of job applications over the past couple weeks and haven't heard back from any of them. I felt almost compelled to reach out to a higher power at this point. I sat down on my bed, put my hands together, and started praying. Dear Heavenly Father, I reach out to you today from a place of unease and worry. I don't know where else to turn. It seems like my life is crumbling apart. I've already lost my loving sister, rest her soul. Bills are stacking up fast. Meals are becoming smaller and less frequent in my attempt to save money. I know I haven't come to you before, and I know that asking for your help may even be audacious of me. But if you can extend any signal that you are here and watching over me, please reveal it to me. Please let me know that there is some light at the end of the tunnel. A little glimmer of hope is all I need to push through right now. Thank you, and may you watch over me as I know you are watching over Kennedy. Amen. With that short prayer, I got into bed and scrolled through Instagram aimlessly until my eyes grew heavy. About half an hour later, I was asleep. I began dreaming heavily. I was inside my bedroom, and I was laying in the same position that I had gone to bed in. The moon was shining in through my bedroom window, dimly illuminating the rest of the room. I took a moment to look around before staring up at the ceiling for what seemed like eternity. This was pretty boring compared to the usual scenarios that played out. I wasn't running haphazardly from some unseen force, or drifting uncontrollably through the void of space. The mundane nature of the dream quickly changed when a sudden flash of light enveloped the entire bedroom. I was now stuck in a world where there was nothing but white. I was standing upright, looking into a vast nothingness. I turned around and tried to notice anything that stood out against the blank backdrop. I began navigating aimlessly for what seemed like hours. I ran, jumped, hopped, and flailed around, before finally growing tired and just sitting down on the blank ground beneath me. Suddenly, I saw a blue object off in the distance. I stood back up and focused on it. It was almost too small to perceive, but by this time I had gotten so used to pure white that a speck of dust would have stood out to me. The object got larger and larger as it drew closer. I realized that what I was observing was a small blue flame floating towards me. I watched in awe. It was as if this flame was entrancing me. It finally stopped at what I perceived to be a few feet in front of me. It began to speak in a pleasant, soft voice in the tone of what I would describe as a young woman. "It was you who reached out to God earlier, wasn't it?" It said slowly and calmly. I was shocked at the seemingly sentient blue flame that was talking to me. Yes," I stammered. "Who might you be?" I asked nervously. "I am one of his angels." The voice replied with a reverberating echo. "I came to you because your spirit is writhing in worry." The flame continued. "I have descended onto you to be the signal you so fervently requested of the Lord a few hours ago." Even if it was part of a dream, this felt extremely surreal. Usually, whatever conversations that went on in my dreams were short, vague, and nonsensical when I experienced them. But this angel spoke with astounding clarity, making the moment extremely vivid. Can you help me? Is God able to help me? Is there any hope that I can get out of this predicament that I'm in?" It seemed like forever before the flame began to emanate an echo, beginning its response to my question. "No." I was shocked. What kind of answer was that? All across the board, there was no hope and no elaboration whatsoever. I began to shake as if I had drank too much coffee in one sitting. "What do you mean? Has he no pity for me? Is it because I'm not a Christian?" I asked hastily. "Young one, you need not to be a Christian for the Lord to answer your prayers." I was confused now. So what's the problem? There has to be some reason why I'm not being acknowledged by him. And why does he need someone else to respond to my prayer? I was beginning to regain my composure as I engaged in further conversation with this angel. "You are not acknowledged by God because nobody is acknowledged by God. The Lord abandoned humanity thousands of years ago." The voice said as calm as can be. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My anxiety began to creep up on me again. Where would Kennedy be if God abandoned his post? But humans were a species designed in God's likeness, the voice interjected. He considered them to be his crowning achievement. When he put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, he would watch them with joy day after day as they carried out their lives. However, contrary to what the Bible says, it was not a snake or a devil or any other malevolent force that caused them to eat the forbidden fruit. This piqued my interest. What made them do it then? God created humans in his own likeness, and as such granted them the same free will that he had since the moment they came into existence. The problem is, God is not an infallible, omnipotent being as you humans believe him to be. The voice grew softer in its projection. Sometimes things went wrong. Single-celled organisms were his first attempt at creating a sentient life form, but their forms and functions were way off from what he had envisioned. He repeated his creation experiments for billions of years, creating life form after life form after life form. He got close to what he wanted when he formed primates, but even they did not meet his standards. When God finally created Adam and Eve, he thought he had finally done it. My mind was boggled at this point. I kept listening with uneasy interest. The Lord oversaw his greatest achievements as they wandered around the Garden of Eden, which he had generated especially for them. Adam and Eve had bore several children, and were carefree beings filled with happiness and joy. The garden was a huge expanse of lush, green forests and crystal clear waters. It was a paradise on earth that served as a home for the frolicking humans. However, one day, Adam and Eve stumbled upon a tree that bore a singular apple from one of its branches. This is where the snake descended and tricked Eve into eating the apple, right? I asked. No, the voice corrected me. The two of them laid eyes on the lone apple at the exact same time, and immediately sought to satiate their hunger with this fruit. It was at this point that a fatal flaw in God's development of humans made itself apparent. The voice paused. Greed overcame both Adam and Eve. Greed was an emotion that God did not anticipate to be a product of the human's free will. When God witnessed his perfect creatures clawing each other to death over the apple, he realized that the free will that had caused them to maul each other was the same free will that he possessed himself. Realizing that he was just as prone to sin as his supposedly perfect creations, the Lord went insane. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. God went insane? A feeling of dread overwhelmed me as I awaited the angel's next response. Yes, the Lord shamefully retreated into obscurity and left us angels wandering the universe, tormented by the fruitless prayers of Adam and Eve's descendants. Each and every one of you humans is descended from that ill-fated couple, and the evils of the world are spontaneously committed as a result of your flawed free will. None of us angels have the slightest clue where God went, or where he is at this moment. All we can do is listen to and address the cries of his perfect beings, who are more hopeless now than ever before. I didn't know how to process what I was hearing, let alone respond. If all this was true, then money was the least of my problems. Where's my sister? Where is Kennedy? I asked hastily. That depends, the disembodied voice replied as the flame flickered. It depends? On what? I was growing impatient. On whether an angel helped to escort her soul into the ethereal realm upon death. As I said, we angels were left without direction once the Lord abandoned us. The true among us try our best, but we are not omnipotent. We cannot have a hand in every human event, be it death, prayer, baptism, or anything else. Our numbers have waned and our divine will has wilted in the absence of God. Angels now occupy one of an infinite number of points on the spectrum of morality, just as humans do. Some stay true to their original missive instilled by the Lord. However, some prefer to do nothing and drift endlessly. Others have decided to dedicate themselves to nefarious activities in the absence of God's authority. The blue flame dimmed, and the emanating voice grew somber. Have you seen your sister's apparition since she passed? No, I don't believe in such things, I answered. It doesn't matter what you believe. Apparitions are real and they exist. Contrary to what humans think, these beings are not evil or lost. They are merely the intermediate product of a human soul transitioning into the ethereal realm. Angels guide them as they complete this process. Once the apparition stage is complete, the soul melts away and ceases to be. No afterlife, no heaven or hell, just on thinking, on feeling eternity. If you haven't seen your sister's apparition at least once following her passing, it means she never transitioned. So where is she then? I'm tired of your rambling. Are you not supposed to bring me comfort and peace? I yelled with tears forming in my eyes. No, quite the opposite actually. The white nothingness around me went completely dark. The blue flame extinguished itself as I heard distant, guttural laughter coming from the darkness I was now in. I frantically look around and yell out, trying to locate this angel that I thought was going to help me. You see, I'm one of those angels that happens to be quite fond of tormenting you humans. A distant voice from my left announced. The voice relocated to my right. In fact, when I saw your sister hanging on to the last threads of her life, I was the first angel to lay claim to her spirit. I turned around with my fists balled up as the voice now tried to flank me from behind. I happen to know exactly where your sister is, and how she's doing. Do you want to see her? The voice tormented me. Show yourself. I don't care what you are. I'll kill you if you lay your hands on her. I was screaming at the top of my lungs with pure anger coursing through me. There was nothing but silence now. I stood still in the dark, waiting for the slightest indication that the angel was still there. My head grew numb and tinnitus rang in my ears as I focused on the unfathomably silent surroundings. The ringing stopped when I heard my sister's voice in the distance. Help me! I turned around to see Kennedy emerge from the darkness on all fours. She was naked and her head was forcefully rotated upside down. Her limbs were unnaturally long, and her breathing was raspy and loud. The stench that filled the air was unbearable. Kennedy, or what was left of her, was looking around the endless darkness with rapid twitches of the neck and head before facing directly towards me. In the split second that I had locked eyes with her, a grin formed on her inverted face. Yellow, broken teeth made themselves fully apparent as her pupils shrunk with excitement. Kennedy lifted both her right arm and right leg in tandem, reaching forward before doing the same coordinated movement with her left arm and leg. She began crawling towards me on all fours at a gradually faster speed, her hands and feet making a sickening crunch sound with each step. She stopped right in front of me and stood up on her legs, her face mere inches away from my own. She looked me in the eyes. I can't wait to see you again, brother. I woke up in a cold sweat. My heart was beating faster than I had ever felt it beat before. I was grasping for air, panning around the room for danger. Nothing. I lay awake, flinching at the slightest sound of the house settling or of animals rustling outside. I just closed my eyes, waiting in terror as my consciousness slowly drifted away back into sleep. Before I could fully knock out, though, I heard the bedroom door creak open. "I've finally found you," Kennedy said before the sickening crunching of her limbs returned. She got into my bed and I didn't hear a peep for the rest of the night. While fully coming to terms with all this has been tough, I still love my sister to death. I'll never abandon her, nor will she ever abandon me. I'm a receptionist, but not just any old paper pusher you'd find at your local dentist or doctor. No, I take care of the front desk at our town's local police station. Much more intense. Which one? Yeah, nice try. I don't need anyone else harassing me on top of the regulars we already see on the daily. Plus, you're not going to want to visit after you hear what lurks in these parts. The station was already up to its neck in paperwork on this particular week. You see, multiple bodies had been found in the woods. Every time a new one was discovered, the workload increased. We weren't too worried about these corpses at first. I know it sounds crazy when I put it like that. How can one, let alone the police force, not be concerned about dead people popping up? Well, strange thing was, these bodies were old. Incredibly old. Like, really fucking old. I'm talking ancient people from centuries past. Mummified remains, if you will. Kind of like the ones you see on the Discovery Channel in the early hours of the morning. Granted, history wasn't our forte. We brought in all sorts of experts from around the country. Scientists, archaeologists, an array of carbon dating academics. They all stopped by to throw in their 2 cents on who these people once were. Naturally, quite a bit of buzz began to stir around town. Unfortunately, excitement of this caliber always brings the crazies out. Andy. I looked up from my computer to find an elderly lady at the front desk. I didn't recognize her. How did she know my name? Hello, ma'am. It chimed. Can I help you? She leaned forward. Andy? Andy McMillan? She knew my full name. I realized there must be some connection. It was a small town, after all. What this link was, though, I had no clue. I'm sorry, have we met? I asked. It looked like my question caused tears to well up in her eyes. They did look familiar. She struggled to push the next words out. Rose Dawson. I gave her a blank stare. I knew the name. In fact, I knew that name very well. Rose Dawson was the name of the girl with whom I shared my first kiss, although this was close to 10 years ago. I hadn't seen her since school ended, but I knew she was still living nearby. For a brief second, everything seemed to click into place. Oh, are you Rose's grandmother? There were definitely tears this time. I tried again. Rose's mother? The salty water started to stream down her face. It's me, Andy. I'm Rose Dawson. I must have given off the impression that I thought she was nuts. The lack of words coming out of my mouth didn't help either. I mean, can you blame me? She sounded completely loony. The Rose Dawson I knew was the same age as me. I knew that as a fact. The old lady doubled down. Listen to me, Andy. You have to get people out of this town. All of these bodies in the woods. I know what happened to them. It happened to me. I saw it. I attempted to defuse the situation. The lady was quickly getting frantic and confused. Ma'am, it's all right. I need you calm so we can help. She put a hand on her head. Stop calling me ma'am. It's me, Rose. I pressed a button beneath my desk to call for some assistance. It looked like we were going to have to get in touch with a nursing home about a runaway patient. My fellow officers arrived and whisked her into the office. I told them to try and track down the real Rose to see if she could come in. There had to be a lead there. The station's entrance was quiet once again. I sat in the silence. It made me sad to think that one day I could deteriorate to that level of confusion. 10 minutes passed before the phone broke into a shrill ring. I snatched at it. Hello? It was the boys from the office. They hadn't had much success with her either. She was still claiming to be Rose Dawson, and they hadn't managed to track down the real one yet. Sounded like it was going to be a rough afternoon. That being said, she had elaborated on her story a bit more. She claimed there was a creature roaming the outskirts of town, something about not looking into its eyes. The boys wanted to know if she'd mentioned any other names which they could try to track down. As I went to explain that she somehow knew my name, a voice interrupted. "Excuse me?" I glanced up from my desk and found another elderly person looking back at me. This time, a man. A very old man. It looked like his skin was vacuum sealed to his face. His skeletal frame was clearly visible. "Sorry, just a minute," I blurted. I relayed the little information I had back to my coworkers and hung up. The old man smiled sweetly, waiting patiently. I turned my attention back to him. "Sounds like you got quite the pickle there." He chuckled. "Yeah, it's been quite the day. Quite the week, actually." I sighed. With a quick shake of the head, I caught myself before I trauma dumped on the civilian and changed topic. "Sorry, how can I help you, sir?" "Oh, don't mention it. I apologize for bothering you. I was just wondering if you could point me in the direction of the main strip. I'm from out of town, you see." Now this was more my speed. I briefly provided clear and direct directions to the town center. He seemed very appreciative, thanking me for my time with kind green eyes. It felt good to see my job was doing something for the world. A nice break from the earlier chaos. Just before the gentleman exited the foyer, he stopped. "I hate to pry, my dear boy, but what was this talk on the phone of a creature in the woods?" I threw a dismissive wave. Don't worry about that. Just a disturbed citizen." He nodded with a grin. "Not some urban folklore I should be aware of?" He seemed harmless enough and didn't seem like the type to run around spreading rumors. I decided to tell him. "Definitely not one I've heard before. The poor lady thinks there's something in the woods that can age you just by looking at it." He laughed. "I wouldn't spend too long looking into that one if I were you. Not worth the little time you have left." I wasn't sure if that was just a friendly comment or a threat at first. He threw up a hand to bid farewell and staggered out. I turned back to my computer only to be faced with a black screen. It must have gone to sleep when I was distracted. Low power mode to save energy. I wished I had some energy after my exhausting week. I felt like I'd aged 60 years. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the screen's glass and realized I had. So I'll try to keep this relatively short. My wife and I sold our first house to capitalize on the housing market and used the windfall to pay off our student loans and the car, etc. After a year of renting at an insanely high price per month, we decided we wanted to buy again. We found an old house in the old part of town. When I say old, I mean old. The house was built in 1883, which makes it 140 years old next year. Single story, 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom. We were the only bid on the house, which, considering the market right now, was very hard to believe, but regardless, the house was ours and my wife, myself, and our daughter moved in. The house was covered in crosses all over the main level. Not being Christian, we removed these. At first, it was what it was. An old house comes with old problems, but it was nothing we couldn't handle. It wasn't until we found the door to the basement that everything changed. The basement was hand dug out with poured cement and carpeting and divided into 2 sections separately by a wall and a door. The first section was carpeted and what I call presentation ready. It's the area you'd show company. From this first area, you could access the hydro panel and have room for storage. The area beyond the door was about as different as you could get. Bare concrete floor, strange writing on the walls, false wall panels, etc. If I had a choice, I'd stay out of there entirely, but it's how you get to the water heater and the furnace, so I went down regularly. While I was downstairs one day working in the first part of the basement, I heard a strange noise from beyond the partition. Thinking it was the furnace, I went to check it out. Entering the second area, I walked past the strange writing on the walls to the furnace when I noticed a strange, small door built into the wall. The only thing we knew about the previous owners was that the family had owned the house for 100 years, and were known in the neighborhood as being very strange and kept entirely to themselves. Opening the door, I found a small stone statue of a tall figure wearing tattered robes, a hood covering his face, and horrific tentacles coming from under. The noise happened again, and I dropped the statue out of shock, and it broke on the floor. Inside the opening was a bunch of old, yellowed papers and books. I didn't want to touch anything else, so I left and went upstairs. That night, after the sun set, we heard rumbling in the basement, and we swore we heard something growling. The next morning, I went downstairs and found the walls covered with a symbol I didn't recognize, and I grew afraid. We hired someone to come out and look at it. The hired hand went downstairs and never came back. I don't know how to explain it. The partition door closed behind him, locked, and the noise came again, and when he started screaming, I pried the door open, but he was gone, and the statue was back in place and whole again. We don't know if it was the removal of the crosses that brought them back into our world. We've become devoted servants because we have no choice to keep our family safe. I send offerings down to the beast or whatever it is, and it leaves us alone. I've taken to displaying the statue upstairs, and I've read the books. I know what the sign is, and I know who the statue is, but I cannot write it here. You can come over, and I'd be happy to tell you. It'll have to be at night, when the stars are right, and Carcosa calls, and you can see my basement for yourself. But first, I'm curious. Have you seen the yellow sign? My sister has always played with dolls. For an 8-year-old, I have never found it weird or strange. Chrissy, my sister, is one of those kids who will join dance or shop at Claire's whenever she goes to the mall. She's just a happy kid. My sister and I were never close. Maybe because I'm 7 years older than her. Maybe it's because she was more bright and outgoing while I prefer to keep to myself. For the most part, Chrissy and I could easily coexist without issue. I mean, it wasn't hard. Our mom had always been on conference meetings and work trips, so there was nobody to make us talk to each other. I guess the whole thing started when Mom came back from one of her meetings. Usually, Mom brings us presents to make up for her being gone for so long. For me, a European brand of shoes, and for Chrissy, 5 dolls. The dolls looked like regular dolls, the classic Barbie doll figure, and the painted-on smile. Some of them had dark brown hair, some of them were blondes, and one was ginger. Some had braids, another had a bun, and the rest had their hair down. They were pretty to say the least, like plastic models, and of course Chrissy loved them. I remember she immediately ran up to them in her dollhouse where all of her Barbies lived. Mom didn't stay long. She had another flight to catch. She was gone before dinner time. I made both me and Chrissy dinner, and we went to sleep. Or tried to, because I was woken up by Chrissy's screams. Being the overprotective sibling I am, I sprinted down the hallway and burst into her room, only to see her crying on her bed. "Chrissy, what happened? Why did you scream?" My little sister tried to speak in between sobs. The dolls, they want to take me away." I found this very disturbing, but it was late and I was tired. So I put the dolls in a wooden chest and locked it. I gave Chrissy the key so she might feel safe, and then I went back to sleep. I woke up. This time it was morning, but something was off. My head felt lighter than usual. That's when I realized a large chunk of my hair was missing. I screamed, jumped out of bed, and went to find Chrissy. "Chrissy!" I yelled, furious at the 8-year-old. I marched to her door and swung it open. "Chrissy, what did you do to my hair?" She looked up at me innocently. She was holding 2 of the dolls that she had been so afraid of the previous night. Of course she was. "What do you mean? I didn't do anything." She turned back to her dolls, whispering something I couldn't hear. I rolled my eyes at her. "Sure, Chrissy. When..." I stopped to look at one of the dolls she was grasping. "Sally here finds that her hair is gone. Don't blame me." And with that, I walked out, slamming the door behind me. The day was uneventful, other than me getting a haircut. I ordered pizza for Chrissy and I, but when I called her down to eat, I got no response. "Chrissy, get down here." Still, nothing. I climbed the stairs and into the hallway, making my way to my sister's room. The door was slightly open. I was about to open it more when I heard Chrissy speak. "Is it finished? The doll?" Chrissy's voice sounded different. "Yes, I propose we should take them tonight." One of Chrissy's dolls spoke. A third one chimed in. "Let me see it." Her voice was scratchy and broken. The first doll then walked towards the wooden box I had locked them in earlier and pulled out another doll. This one was lifeless, and also looked exactly like me. If I hadn't made enough mistakes already, my stupid self decided to make the biggest one. I audibly gasped. All the dolls' heads abruptly turned to see me peeking through the crack. The dolls then fell down as if they were never standing. Chrissy too looked at me before getting up and closing the door. I am now in my room writing this so that maybe someone else can learn and benefit from my story. Maybe someone can contact my mother to tell her what has happened. I can hear the plastic from the doll's body hitting my door and trying to undo the lock. Growing up, I was always told I had an active imagination. I spent most of my childhood reading and writing because my mom wanted to foster that imagination. However, as I got older, my imagination became less cute. The stories I was writing were less, "There's a fairy village in my garden," and more, "The man living in my wardrobe." I grew up in a home that celebrated everything, so my family used to sit down once every few weeks and I'd read them one of my stories. It was after one of these readings that my mom asked me if what I wrote was true. Sometimes, other times I rewrite things that people have told me. I had answered. "What people?" The question extremely offended 11-year-old me, as I didn't have that many friends at the time, and it sounded like she was picking on me for that. "My friends." She looked at me for a little too long after I said that. Truthfully, I knew why. No 11-year-old girl could come up with the stories I wrote, active imagination or not. They came from Elizabeth, as I call her. She liked my writing, but said I needed more help with inspiration, so she'd give me prompts. She'd show up places, point at things, and try to tell me what to write. Obviously, Elizabeth is a spirit. She's been with me for as long as I can remember, keeping me safe in her own ways. But she doesn't haunt me. She's my friend, my protector. "Sweetie, are these friends of yours alive?" This one question, along with my obvious answer, sparked years and years of lessons from my mom. She believes I inherited my gift from her. However, mine is a lot stronger and affects my everyday life a lot more than hers does. She's taught me how to ignore it, how to rid myself of the spirits that aren't welcome, and how to keep the ones that are at an arm's length. Now, I'll bring you to the present, 10 years later to be exact. It started about a month ago. I fell into the deepest pit of depression I ever have been in. I spent all the money I'd been saving to move out on drugs, nights out, and endless amounts of online shopping, all in an attempt to bring myself back to me. It started to work until I saw him. A man standing about 100 meters away from me in the middle of a shopping center. The only thing differentiating him from everyone else was his face. In fact, he didn't exactly have one. There was an outline of what could have been, but it wasn't enough of one to make me comfortable. Positive spirits always try to make themselves appear as comforting as physically possible. This guy was not trying to do that. Usually I could brush this off and go on about my day like it was nothing, but seeing this guy mess with me in a way that no other spirit ever has. The feeling he left me with sat in my stomach for days. I tried everything to ease it, but it never left. I think what left me most uneasy about seeing him was that I haven't seen Elizabeth since. I've always felt safe from these kinds of spirits because she always appears right after I see them, to kind of remind me that she's keeping an eye out. I can't even feel her presence anymore. About a week after his first appearance, I finally felt normal again, physically and mentally. I was getting back to all my normal routines and finally talked to my friends again. It was a nice feeling of finally digging myself out of the hole I'd fallen in. Then, there he was. Closer this time, but still in a public place. I was at dinner with my friends. He also felt the need to join. On the other side of the restaurant, standing with his arms by his side, staring directly at me. Nothing about his expression changed, but he moved this time. Cocked his head to the side as if studying me. He stayed like that through the whole dinner, just watching me. It felt like a threat. I wish I had listened. After that night, he appeared more frequently, never giving me enough time to recover from him before popping back up. It was a week ago that he started making true on his threatening presence. Last Monday, I was in my bedroom watching some sitcom while putting away my laundry when my lights went out. All of them. I have 3 lamps in my room that stay on day and night because I'm not a huge fan of darkness. When I tried to get the one closest to me back on, nothing happened. I reached for my phone, grabbing the torch, and made my way out of the room. I'd assumed that we'd had a blackout. The brightness that met me when I opened my door immediately proved me wrong. I walked out to see my dad sitting in his office. Hey, did we have a power surge or something? The confusion I was met with left an unsettling feeling in my stomach. I told him that something had happened in my room and he sighed before going in to have a look. He came back with his arms full of light bulbs. All blown. I've got a couple spares though. He explained that their death was probably due to me leaving the lights on 24/7, but I did not believe him. As I was helping my dad find new bulbs in the garage, I saw the man again, standing right beside my father, one of his hands resting on a box. Assuming that that was the box containing the light bulbs, I told my dad not to worry, and that I'd sleep in with my little sister that night. Tuesday was eerily calm until I fell asleep. I had possibly the most realistic nightmare I've ever had in my entire life. If you can even call it that. I never truly felt like I was sleeping, just lying there with my eyes closed. The visions, I guess you could call it, contained several moments, each specifically detailing ways that I could die. Most of them involved vehicles, some where I was driving, a passenger, crossing the road, etc. He was in every single one, just standing there with his arms by his side, staring at me. In each one, he was the last thing I saw before it went dark. On Wednesday, my friends and I decided to drive to a house one of them has on the beach, because winter never deterred us from a good surf. I drove 2 of them in my car, mostly because I knew the roads like the back of my hand, and I didn't recognize a single road in any of my visions. I also didn't think he'd be obvious enough to give me visions of my possible death the night before I died. I knew he'd hit when I least expected it. The next 24 hours felt like bliss for me. We spent the day at the beach, followed by a fire there that night. He didn't appear once. The next morning, after realizing we skimped on groceries, we decided to go to a cafe for breakfast before hitting the beach again. I drove. This time only with one passenger because she had something to tell me about a romantic moment between her and another friend the night before. I was caught up in her story when I realized I'd missed a turn. My heart fell into my stomach when I recognized a road that I had never driven that far down before. I turned a sharp bend and noticed a car stopped in the middle of the road just a moment too late. The impact knocked everything out of me. I immediately turned to see my friend reaching down to grab her phone from underneath her. The relief I felt was short-lived because there he was, standing on the other side of the road, watching me with his arms crossed. Even without a face, I could sense his disappointment. He disappeared almost as soon as he'd appeared. Everyone involved in the accident is fine. I'm the only one who walked away with injuries that will take longer than a week to heal. I haven't seen him since that day. It's been almost a week. I'm terrified. I've left my room only for doctor's appointments, food, and the bathroom. I know what this means. Even if it wasn't his goal, he has me at my weakest now. He could strike at any given moment. And it would work. For once in my life, I have no idea how to save myself from a spirit. I fear I'm going to spend the rest of my life running from death. What if the accident was just luck? What if he succeeds next time? Is he going to stick around until finally he is the last thing I see before the darkness? I don't know anything, and my biggest fear right now is getting answers.